while you are panicking about the 2026 market crash, the world's oldest financial dynasty is quietly smiling. Because to you, this is a crisis. To them, it is a clearance sale. Everyone thinks they know the story of the Rothschilds. The history books tell you they built their empire on a lucky carrier pigeon, a bird that supposedly brought them early news of the Battle of Waterloo, allowing them to manipulate the London Stock Exchange and buy Britain for pennies. It is a great story, but it is a distraction. A fairy tale designed to keep the masses looking in the wrong direction. The truth is far more methodical, far more ruthless, and infinitely more relevant to what is happening to your bank account right now. There is a devastating rule in finance, a curse that haunts the rich. It is the rule of the third generation. 90% of wealthy families lose their entire fortune by the time the grandchildren take over. The first generation builds it, the second generation maintains it, and the third generation destroys it. Yet, the Rothschild dynasty has held its ground for over 200 years. They have survived world wars, hyperinflation, the 1929 Great Depression, the 2008 financial collapse, and they are positioned perfectly for the silent depression of 2026. How do they do it? When everyone else fails, they do not rely on luck, they do not rely on stock tips, and they certainly do not rely on the conventional financial advice that Wall Street feeds to the middle class. They operate on a hidden financial blueprint, a set of unspoken rules that govern generational wealth, rules that dictate how money moves when the world burns. Today, we are going to open that vault. We are going to tear down the myths and expose the exact psychological and financial frameworks they use to weaponize chaos. This is not about getting rich quick. This is about building a fortress around your wealth, so that when the financial winter arrives, you are not the one freezing in the streets, you are the one buying the city. Welcome to the Rothschild Blueprint. Let us look around us today. The headlines are screaming about inflation, liquidity traps, and collapsing purchasing power. The average investor is terrified, paralyzed by fear, watching their portfolio bleed out. But if you zoom out, if you look through the lens of history, you will see that wealth never actually disappears during a recession. It simply changes hands. It flows from the impatient to the patient, from the uneducated to the prepared. The elites know that a crisis is nothing more than a transfer of wealth. And the blueprint they use to orchestrate this transfer is built on a foundation that the middle class has been taught to despise. It starts with a fundamental misunderstanding of what money actually is and how it should be deployed when the system fractures.
Educational and historical content only, not financial advice.
Let us talk about the greatest lie ever sold to the middle class. For decades, financial advisors and mainstream media have drilled one specific concept into your head. Cash is trash. Cash is a guaranteed loss to inflation. You must stay fully invested in the market at all times, or you will be left behind. But when you examine the Rothschild blueprint, you realize that the elite do not view cash as an investment at all. They view it as ammunition. They view it as crisis liquidity. Imagine a battlefield. If you deploy all your troops and fire all your ammunition before the enemy even arrives, what happens when the real war actually starts? You are slaughtered. In the financial world, that battlefield is a recession. And right now, as we navigate through 2026, we are watching the storm clouds gather. The middle class is fully deployed. Their money is locked up in overpriced real estate. Speculative tech stocks and retirement accounts they cannot touch without paying massive penalties. They have absolutely no dry powder. But the elites, the architects of generational wealth, they have been quietly stockpiling cash. They do not do this because they enjoy earning a measly 4 or 5% yield at the bank. They do it because they understand the mechanical reality of a systemic collapse. When the market fractures, credit freezes, banks stop lending money. The hedge funds and retail investors who borrowed heavily to buy assets at the absolute top are suddenly hit with margin calls. The broker demands more capital, and if they do not have it, they are forced to sell. They are forced to liquidate their portfolios, not because they want to, but because they have to just to survive the week. And who is waiting patiently on the other side of that forced liquidation? The family with the liquidity. This is the first pillar of the blueprint. The Rothschilds understood centuries ago that during a financial panic, the price of an asset disconnects completely from its true fundamental value. A prime piece of commercial real estate, a highly profitable energy company, or a critical piece of infrastructure might suddenly drop 50, 60, or even 80% in value. Not because the asset itself is broken, but simply because the current owner has run out of cash and is desperate. If you are holding cash during a massive economic boom, yes, you are slowly losing purchasing power. But if you are holding cash during a severe liquidity crisis, your purchasing power multiplies exponentially overnight. When you buy during a crash, you are no longer just buying an asset. You are buying the sheer desperation of the seller. It is a brutal, unforgiving game. But it is exactly how financial empires are expanded. The true titans of wealth do not buy when the sun is shining and everyone on the street is getting rich. They wait in the shadows. They hold their capital in reserve. And they wait for the inevitable moment when the panic sets in. There is a quote, a legendary piece of financial lore attributed to Baron Nathan Rothschild that has been whispered in the corridors of power for over 2 centuries. Buy when there is blood in the streets, even if the blood is your own. Most people hear that quote and think it is just a dramatic metaphor. It is not. It is the literal psychological operating system of the 1%. It is the exact mindset that separates the architects of generational wealth from the victims of systemic collapse. To understand this, you have to understand the difference in the pain threshold between the middle class and the true financial elite. The average investor operates entirely on biological instinct. Fight or flight. When the economy is booming, greed takes over. They buy at the top because everyone else is buying. But when the cycle turns, when the market drops 20, 30, or 50%, panic sets in. The amygdala hijacks the brain. The average person watches their life savings evaporate on a screen, and the psychological pain becomes so intense that they hit the sell button just to make the bleeding stop. They sell at the exact bottom, locking in their losses forever. But the Rothschild Blueprint requires something entirely different. It requires a state of ruthless detachment. The elites do not view a market crash as a personal tragedy. They do not feel the biological panic because their survival is never actually threatened. Why? Because they are not investing the rent money for next month. They are not gambling with a retirement fund they need to access in 5 years. They have structured their wealth in a way that completely removes human emotion from the equation. When you look at how these dynasties operate, you see that their money is locked inside trusts, holding companies, and multi-generational foundations. These entities do not feel fear. They do not read sensational headlines. They execute a predetermined strategy. When the blood starts flowing in the streets, when retail investors are screaming at the television and begging the central banks for a bailout, the elite are utterly silent. They are calculating. They look at a devastated market, and they do not see destruction. They see a mathematical anomaly. They see that the underlying utility of a prime asset has not actually changed. Only the price has dropped because the previous owner was forced to liquidate in a panic. This is the moment the trap is sprung. This is when they deploy that stockpiled crisis liquidity we just talked about. They step into the absolute worst economic conditions imaginable, when everyone else is paralyzed by fear. And they systematically acquire the most valuable resources on Earth. Prime real estate, energy sectors, infrastructure, hard commodities. They buy them for pennies on the dollar, knowing with absolute certainty that the economic cycle will eventually turn. It is cold. It is calculated. And it is entirely devoid of emotion. If you ever look closely at the family crest of the Rothschild dynasty, you will notice an image of a hand grasping 5 arrows. The history books will tell you that this represents the 5 sons of the founding father, who were sent to the 5 major financial capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. But that is just the surface-level interpretation. The real meaning behind the 5 arrows is far more strategic. It is the ultimate geopolitical shield. It represents absolute, uncompromising diversification. Look at how the average person invests today. They take every single dollar they earn and they tie it to one country, one currency, and one asset class. They put their entire life savings into the United States stock market, denominated entirely in United States dollars, while living in a house subject to the tax laws of one single government. If that government makes a catastrophic policy error, if that currency loses its global reserve status, or if that specific stock market experiences a lost decade, that investor is completely wiped out. They have no shield. They have no backup plan. They are sitting ducks in a geopolitical crossfire. The Rothschild Blueprint dictates that true wealth must never be confined by imaginary lines drawn on a map. True wealth must be stateless. The 5 arrows principle means dividing your empire across multiple jurisdictions, multiple fiat currencies, and multiple classes of hard assets. They hold physical gold in private vaults, agricultural land across different continents, energy infrastructure, and cash reserves in a basket of the strongest global currencies. Why? Because history proves that governments rise and fall. Currencies are eventually inflated away into nothingness. Empires collapse under the weight of their own debt. But if your wealth is spread across 5 distinct pillars, the destruction of one pillar does not collapse the roof. In fact, it creates the perfect opportunity. If one nation experiences hyperinflation or a catastrophic market crash, the other 4 arrows are perfectly insulated. They remain strong, and they can immediately pump capital back into the devastated region, buying up the ashes of the fallen economy for absolute pennies. They do not fear the collapse of a single system because they own pieces of the chessboard everywhere. They have removed the single point of failure that destroys 99% of families. While the middle class begs their local politicians to save the economy, the elite simply shift their capital to the arrow that is currently flying the highest. But everything we have discussed so far, the liquidity, the psychological detachment, the 5 arrows of diversification, none of it matters if you do not understand the final piece of the blueprint. This is the absolute climax of the strategy. It is the ultimate secret that separates the newly rich from the permanently wealthy. The greatest weapon the elite possess is not money. It is not insider information. It is time. The average retail investor, and even the most aggressive Wall Street hedge funds, are completely trapped in a microscopic time horizon. They are obsessed with the next quarter. They need to see massive profits in 3 months, or they panic and sell. They day trade. They chase the latest technology bubble. They flip properties because they need the cash flow tomorrow. They are playing a frantic game of musical chairs, terrified that the music will stop before they can sit down. The Rothschild Blueprint completely eliminates the concept of tomorrow. They do not invest for the next quarter. They do not even invest for their own lifetime. When a true financial dynasty buys an asset, they are looking at a 100-year horizon. They are placing capital into untouchable trusts and legal structures designed specifically to benefit descendants who have not even been born yet. This creates a phenomenon known in the highest tiers of finance as time arbitrage. And it is the most unfair advantage in the history of capitalism. Think about it. If you need to make money in the next 12 months to pay off a mortgage or fund a lifestyle, you are forced to take massive risks. You are forced to buy at the absolute top of a manic bubble, desperately hoping some greater fool will buy it from you before the system collapses. But if your time horizon is 100 years, you are invincible. You can afford to sit in pure cash for an entire decade. You can afford to wait patiently in the shadows while the world tears itself apart over inflation and political chaos. You do not care if the market drops 40% next year, because you are not selling next year. And when the 2026 crash inevitably arrives, and the impatient masses are completely liquidated by the banks, the dynasty simply steps forward. They acquire the most valuable agricultural land, the critical energy infrastructure, the timeless physical assets, and they lock them away in a vault for another century. They win every single time because they flat out refuse to play the short game. The middle class trades their time for money, but the elite trade their money for time. You cannot change the corrupt financial system. You cannot stop the central banks from printing endless currency. And you cannot stop the inevitable market crash of 2026. The wheels are already in motion. The wealth transfer has already begun. But you have a choice. You can choose how you position yourself before the storm arrives. The financial winter is not a time to panic. It is a time to execute the blueprint. Are you going to be the average investor? Manipulated by the media, selling your assets in absolute terror when the screen turns red? Or are you going to hold the weapon of crisis liquidity, waiting patiently in the shadows to buy the world for pennies on the dollar? You do not need to carry the Rothschild name to use their strategy. You do not need billions of dollars to start. You only need the discipline to ignore the daily noise, the courage to stand completely against the crowd, and the mindset for wealth. The elite want you to stay distracted. They want you to stay poor. They want you to panic. Do not give them what they want. If you are ready to step out of the matrix, if you want to survive the coming wealth transfer and learn the hidden financial strategies that the 1% use to protect their empires, you must subscribe to the Mindset for Wealth channel right now. Hit the like button to signal the algorithm that you are awake. Share this with someone who needs to hear the truth before the liquidity crisis destroys their portfolio. The winter is coming. Make sure your financial pantry is full. We will see you in the next video.